Hi, everybody. Hello, all. Hope you can all hear me. Thank you for the thumbs up there. Fantastic. I'm going to give it a minute or so just to let a few people join because we know that, getting onto Zoom can take a hot minute sometimes. But I will introduce myself. So, my name is Kelsey. I am a senior consultant at Scede. I specialize in org design and frameworks. We've been having a lot of, hearing a lot from customers about concerns about the directive, what it actually means in practice. So, today's session is going to really be about the legislation. What does it mean for companies, and hopefully trying to lay things out in nice, plain, clear terms. So we will dig in. Any questions as you go along, please do drop them in the Q&A. Hopefully we'll have time to jump to some of those at the end. But lovely to meet you all. So what is the directive? So this is a piece of legislation that is coming out ideally aimed at closing the gender pay gap across the EU. It's setting out the minimum requirements that all EU member states have to put into local law by the 7th of June this year. So that is why that date feels so important. Ultimately, what it really wants to do is create pay equity. So ensuring that people doing like for like work are paid fairly. And one of the biggest things is that although local laws will differ, and there will be some countries that already have transparency laws in their legislation, currently for most countries, transparency is a nice to have. So this legislation is going to put it in as a mandatory obligation for anybody who hires within the EU to put this into their local law, mainly focusing on bringing employee rights to information and reporting obligations as the main focuses of the things that companies need to practice. One of the biggest shifts that the legislation is bringing in is that currently, if somebody believes that they are being paid unfairly or that something unfair has happened, particularly if they think the reason is discrimination, the employee has to prove that it happened. They have to prove that things were unfair, but they don't really have access to the pay data or often the decisions behind why pay has been made. So the new rules recognize that. And now the shift is going to be that employers have to prove that decisions behind pay have not been due to a discriminatory reason, so that they are fair and that practices are fair. And they really have to be able to explain the decision and prove why differences in pay have happened. So one of the questions we have been getting asked is from companies not based in the EU, so UK companies, and whether the laws or whether this new legislation applies to them or not. So short answer is yes. It doesn't matter where the company is headquartered. What matters is where you are hiring. So this includes any company that is going to employ people in an EU country or advertise roles that could be based in the EU. If you're advertising remote roles with the intention that you would happily hire in an EU country. As I said, the legislation as it stands today is setting the minimum requirements. So every EU country may decide that, how they implement that into local law could be slightly different, which obviously makes things very tricky. And so things like how quickly companies have to respond to requests for information, things like fines around failing to adhere to laws, they can all be decided locally by member states. But so one of the things to keep in mind, with this legislation is that local law may vary and may have additional obligations based on what we talk about today. So wherever you are hiring, you really need to look at that local law. One of the things as well is for many companies, especially in the UK, even if you aren't hiring in the EU currently, this is still going to be applicable to you because realistically, we're seeing a shift in the market for more transparency. As it becomes the minimum standard across the EU, you will find candidates' expectations really go up in expecting that level of transparency. And if you do, have people in multiple countries, even if you don't have somebody, even if somebody's hired in the UK, if they know that their counterparts in another location can request access to employee salary data information, then that is going to be something that becomes an expectation as well. We know this is already becoming the norm or becoming more expected globally as well, with many states in the US, California, New York, quite a few other ones already requiring that job ranges go onto salary ranges go into job postings as well. So what are the biggest changes? What are the three things that employers really need to know about when it comes to this legislation? So the first thing is transparency. So any role based in an EU member state has to give a pay range upfront during the hiring process. I'm going to go into this a little bit in a little bit more detail in the next slide, but what is acceptable right now, which are things like saying depending on experience or competitive salary, or very, very, very wide ranges that say DOE from 25,000 to 175,000 are no longer going to be enough. There needs to be a pay range provided upfront. So that's during the hiring process, and internally, existing employees are going to have the right to request information about their pay. So this is their pay range in relation to people doing similar roles, so their gender pay, the average pay by gender, and also they have the right to understand how pay is determined. So companies need to be clearly articulate how they assess like-for-like roles and how they stand behind pay. So your philosophy to pay. Another big change, particularly when it comes to hiring, is that there is going to be a pay history ban. So you are no longer going to be able to ask potential candidates what their salary expectations are during hiring. You have to provide that range up front. You can ask them whether that falls in line with their expectations, but the reason to this is to stop people from continually being underpaid. I'm going to come to this in a bit more detail in a second, but just keeping in mind that you can no longer ask people their expectations and have to provide them one upfront. Alongside this, if you put an initial range in a job advert, will no longer be able to offer less than that initial range without a legitimate reason. So that would be fundamentally hiring that person to do a lesser role as you define it and being able to articulate that clearly. But if you are hiring them for the job that you have advertised, you cannot pay less than that initial range. The last one here, which is going to probably be a big one for a lot of companies, is reporting. The deadlines for reporting aren't the 6th of June. They're staggered depending on the size of your company. But under the directive, there's going to be mandatory gender pay gap reporting. One of the big differences, many countries do this already, but one of the big differences is that where you identify a gender pay gap of over 5% or more, it must be addressed. So you can't just say, we know that we have a gender pay gap. You have to make a move and a plan to close that gap. So for all of these things, failure to adhere to them can be a finable offence. So like we said, member states are really going to have that discretion in setting penalties, but the overarching framework really allows for sanctions where necessary for repeated offensive. I do want to say that, look, these things take time. It's probably likely not going to come in overnight, that there's going to be massive fines. Companies will have a time to go with it, but there are quite significant potential fines. And for example, employee gender discrimination found within. So if you find gender discrimination that hasn't been addressed or hasn't been done properly over a significant period, the EU directive has said that employee payouts are uncapped. So local laws are not allowed to cap those payouts as they do in other areas. Digging into a couple a bit more of these in more detail. So our pay history ban. So as we said, you are no longer allowed to ask people about their history. This is because what we know is if somebody is already underpaid in their job, going to a new job, even if they get a pay increase, when you say to them, what are your salary expectations, they may be getting an increase on that from their new employer. But if they are already underpaid, all we are doing is perpetuating underpayment for somebody doing a role because they don't know their market value. So really, this is the biggest, this is the reason behind that part of the change. So this means that you can no longer say, what is your current salary? And instead you can ask people if the range is in line with their expectations, and you must offer a salary range upfront. The point at which you do that may vary, but as good practice, it should be on that initial job advert. Speaking to that, so the before rule is alongside this, which is where you must show that pay range upfront. So it's the reason behind this is to promote market fairness so that people know at my level, at my role, what are the market paying, what are other companies paying, what are other people earning. This is all about transparency, and it makes it less likely when people have access to information that unfair pay practices will continue. Local laws in member states may say differently about at what point in a hiring process that the salary range has to be provided. So some member states may decide that it has to be upfront in that initial job advert, and other countries may turn around and say, actually, as long as it happens before first interview or before offer, that's absolutely fine. Because of that variation, I would say the best practice is to post ranges in the initial job advert, just so that, especially if you are open to hiring in various places in the EU, you are covered depending on local law. So lots there about the policy. Now I'm going to move into what does it actually mean in practice? What are the practical things that you can do to help you prepare for this? So one of the biggest things that happens in companies right now is that when new hires are made or when people are promoted internally, Pay decisions are often made in isolation. So companies don't step back and look at other people, or hopefully companies do, but many times companies don't look at what people internally doing the same role are being paid. They're often led by market data as it grows and develops over time. Pay really is going to need to be consistent internally. So what this means is that you're looking for those gaps, and where they are, you're addressing them. So whether that is through the way that you hire, ensuring that people come in at a similar salary, or making sure that as salary growth happens based on the market, you are addressing that internally as well. But it's worth always making sure that you factor this in, and you're not just using market salaries or what candidates are asking for. You are also factoring in what you're already paying internally. In order to make fair, defensible decisions, in order to understand like-for-like roles, in order to understand your pay ranges, you are going to need some form of a framework. This allows you to align pay structures, pay bands, making them clear, and also, like we said, assessing. It is now going to be on the company to be able to say, this is how we decide what a like-for-like, this is how we decide who two people exist in that level. This is how we decide on a like-for-like role. So you need to be able to group people by responsibility, accountability, complexity to make your comparisons justifiable and defensible. So you are going to need some form of framework. There are lots that exist in the market, but you just need to have that as your initial tool for hiring, promotion decisions, anything around pay for your employees. Big thing around hiring is going to be consistent hiring decisions in practice. So you need to ensure that internally your teams are talking to each other. These decisions don't happen in isolation. They involve finance people, hiring managers, lots of different people. So you need to make sure that you understand how and why ranges are used, when you're going to allow flexibility and what that flexibility looks like, and who is going to approve the exceptions, and document those things as well, again, so that you can show that you are acting fairly, making fair exceptions to rules where they exist. And one of the biggest pieces of wording around this is defensible decisions. So it's not all going to, the way I think about it is the 7th of June, there's not going to be like a magic light switch on where everything suddenly has to be perfect and in practice. But it does mean that risk is going to be increased for employers, particularly around candidates and employees who are more likely to question pay now they know that this legislation has come in. So the decisions that you make around pay need to be clear, documented, and explainable if challenges. They are really the main things that need to go in practice. So you need that structure, and you need to be able to explain decisions clearly to your employees and to candidates why your ranges exist. So what do you need to do? What are the things that you need to actually start thinking about if you haven't done already? So that first piece is understand your levels. You need to make sure you know what determines seniority, what determines a role, and what justifies movement, and how people will get promoted within that, to keep things fair and to be able to talk about how and why pay changes for your team. You need to understand your current pay parity. So mapping your employees to levels, looking at their pay and looking particularly for any of those gaps that you see more than 5%, and building a plan to address them, even if it's not going to be overnight, how you plan to make phased changes over the next 6-12 months and what that looks like. So spotting those inconsistencies early. That information will inform your salary ranges. Will need before publishing job adverts or before going to hire or making an offer to a candidate. You want to make sure that those salary ranges are in line with your internal employees, your approved budgets, and that these are salaries that you can realistically hire at, and that they are fair, in line with what you are already paying within the company. You need to have a look at your hiring documents, so your job descriptions and your interview templates. If it says anything about this, what is your current salary? Please take that out of those scripts. Make sure that is not in there, and make sure by default you add salary range to your job descriptions so that you are prompted to add that when you create a new role. Train your hiring managers. There's a risk there if people don't know, they're no longer allowed to ask about the people's current salaries. So make sure they understand the rules, the expectations, and how you plan to create pay fairness for your company. Hiring managers and your talent managers, anybody involved in that hiring process, need to understand your process, your philosophy to pay structure, and how you plan to keep things fair. Prepare yourself for tricky questions from candidates for employees around pay. So you may experience more direct questions. I'm sure many of you get those already. but on pay, progression, fairness, how you make decisions. So start thinking about that, start documenting things and how you're going to answer it and what your shared approach as a company, as a HR team, what that looks like, how you are going to answer those questions consistently. I'm going to cover off some, common concerns, things that we know people think, they say, as they start worrying about pay transparency and what it means for their companies. So I think one of the biggest things we know is companies saying that a salary range could scare good people off. So, i.e., I don't want to put a range out that scares people who we'd willingly pay more and they scared them off because the money's too low. Transparency is going to build trust. People who align to what you are able to pay. And if what you are finding is that you're not getting the right candidate because the people that you want are seeking a higher salary, then that is information that is useful to use. So yes, it may put some people out the running, but the right people who are aligned on expectations will have transparency and it's going to create that market fairness. Wide ranges, yes, of course, they do give you more flexibility, but actually when wide ranges are really, really wide, like I said earlier, spanning over 100,000, they feel like they're not useful. They're not actually telling people the sort of accountability, the sort of role they're expected to hold. So that clarity is going to attract the right people at the right level, but you do need to be clear on that yourself. And also it's going to support that fairness internally, making sure that people doing like-for-like roles are paid equally. I think, this isn't necessarily a myth, but, one of the concerns that people have is that we don't know what level we need. That happens. There may be situations where you don't know actually what level do we need right now, particularly in very fast scaling companies where, it feels a bit of a gray area. You kind of want someone to tell you what you don't know. You can advertise multiple roles, with different ranges, but they have to be distinctly different. So you have to be able to clearly articulate a different scope in order to justify having those two roles out. Candidates, of course, will always want to negotiate above ranges. But when ranges are realistic, when they are aligned to the market and within realistic pay bands, then exceptions should be rarer. So it's a really good chance for you to understand your pay philosophy, where you sit within the market, all of that. And we're focusing here on salary, but there are other benefits you can offer. So what else is part of their package? Can you offer more progression, non-salary incentives, other benefits that all wrap into an offer outside of just base ranges? For fairness, what we want to try and do is stick within those bands. But, where there are exceptions, then being defensible reasons. I think, this is probably a big one. People pay more than us. We're going to lose out. We can't compete with other salaries. So other companies will pay more. Transparency is going to get you the people that are right for you. It enables you to highlight your unique offering. So those other things that I said, but also what is your employer value proposition? What is it that you're bringing to this conversation, like to potential candidates, to your employees? Think wider than that. The transparency is something that is coming into force. It's unavoidable. Competitors may pay more, and this is your opportunity to understand why you pay what you pay and being able to explain it clearly. Employees will be upset when they find pay differences. They're already upset when they talk to their talk to team members and hear what their other people are earning. The challenge when there's no transparency is that people understand information in isolation. They're always going to find out, and actually having a clear framework, having a clear idea of being able to explain in a tangible way and using a framework to say, this is why we pay this is how this decision was made, and this is how we can explain this to you. It's typically the lack of transparency, the lack of the understanding why that people have more of a problem with. And that's usually what the issue is, because they don't understand why decisions have been made. Employees will be upset if they find pay differences, and moving towards transparency will help you articulate differences or close any gaps that you do have that are unfair. Frameworks can be rigid. I think anything used improperly can definitely be very rigid, but it's there to provide guardrails, not handcuffs, is the way that we think about it. So it's for consistency. It's for being able to talk to people about accountability, role, impact, all of those things that help you understand where they sit within an organization. But where there are exceptions, it should allow flex and allow you to articulate why you are making an exception. And I think one of the biggest ones, not being able to afford to bring salaries into alignment. is a reality for a lot of companies. So what you really need to do is focus on the biggest risk areas, identifying those gaps and bringing people to market, to alignment over time, addressing the biggest ones first of all, and phasing in that alignment gradually. Like I said, it's not going to be the 7th of June, a big alarm goes off, everybody, the police start running into companies. That's not the case at all. But small incremental steps now towards fairness and transparency are going to set you up in the long term for success. That is it from me. I can see we've got a couple of questions, so bear with me while I just dig into the questions that we have. So we have one here about data protection in departments with very few employees. This is very true. So companies that have very small departments, so where you're talking about 1 or 2 people, where people request us pay information, it is going to be tricky because you're not going to be able to give information without essentially saying this is what you get paid and this is what another person gets paid. So in those cases, it likely, I can't speak because again, it's going to depend on local law, but it is really going to depend on the information that you can give fairly. So without giving anybody's individual salary away. So it would be about the pay band for that specific role, for that level that people sit in and that pay band for that role. You would have to provide any gender differences, and that would be stating those differences, but it might not be going into the detail other than saying what the percent is or acknowledging that you have that difference and how you plan to address it. Sorry, somebody else has asked, what if you hire in multiple countries? How does that work, as we can't possibly have salary ranges for 30 plus countries as a startup? So this is going to come down to your pay philosophy. So you've asked the question saying, can we use a country multiplier? I guess it really depends on how what the approach is there. So if you're just saying we're fully remote and we're happy to hire in any EU member state, the salary will be an equivalent of this UK range, then it really depends. If you're using a multiplier it depends what it's based on. It's really kind of hard to answer that question, but essentially you need to supply a salary range. So the country that you're hiring in, you need to supply an appropriate salary range for that. It's a bit of a tricky one to answer that one, I'm afraid. So someone's asked what counts as equivalent work. Can I only find this through job evaluation? Yes. So you need a framework and you need to have and a way to assess equivalent work. So you need to understand, like I said, things like impact, scope, autonomy, guidance, all things that are typically you can find there's lots and lots of pay frameworks that exist out there. Anywhere you're getting your pay salary information from will have a type of framework that you could use as a starting point. But really, you just need a tool to be able to evaluate those levels so that you can wrap those salary bands around them. Couple more questions. Bear with me while I just have a look through. So is pay only defined at base pay, or is the expectation to include other cash equivalent? I'm not 100% sure on that, to be honest. As far as I'm aware, it is equity across base pay. I do think there could be some arguments, some other legislation around cash equivalent, but that might depend on local law. So probably have to have a look into that one. As far as I'm aware, it is base pay at this moment. So somebody has asked about, in some countries, like for example, in Brussels, demographic information isn't legal. However, the new directive brings in gender pay gap reporting. So the gender pay gap reporting is going to be a phased approach over the next couple of years. I think the first, I'm not 100% sure on this, but I believe it's June 2027 that the first time to do gender pay gap reporting is going to come in. I believe that one's going to be for anybody with over 200 employees within the entire company. So not just based in the EU, the entire company. And then it shifts down to over 100 people, I believe, the following year. So it's based on the total number of employees in the company, as far as I am aware. We're running out of time, so I'm going to have a last look. Okay, see one last question. So getting back to hiring and employing in different countries, would you recommend having local salary bands to address this? It's very tricky to answer to this because I'm sure lots of you, what you're talking about is you're employing remotely and you're open to anywhere in the EU. Generally speaking, if you're hiring in places where there can be a very vast difference in salary based on location multipliers, cost of living, etc., then you are likely going to do best to have roles with different salary ranges popped on them based on local pay. But I realise that might not always be practical in things. The law is that you have to provide those salary ranges up front. Whether that's in local salary or not, I can't talk to. Again, that's going to come down to local local legislation based on countries. I think that was all the questions. We've got 1 minute left, so I will wrap us up. Thank you very much, everybody, for attending. Hopefully you found this useful. If you do get any more questions, please feel free to pop those over. But enjoy the rest of your day. The recording will be shared alongside some additional information as well. Thank you so much for your time.